Well, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me just the way it is, or do I need to use a mic? Seem to be okay? All right. It's not beer, but it's going to have to do. Well, this morning we want to give you a little bit of an insight as to the early days of the fire department. I had 20 years on the department, and over those years I heard a lot of stories from the older members of the way different things were, and well, what happened to this piece of equipment, or what happened here and there, and it was always conflicting stories. So I thought, well, maybe it'd be time that somebody gets this thing put together and dig back as far as you can and get the real story. So with that, we're going to start. First of all, there was a discrepancy in the department, and I think there still is until maybe today. I don't see any active members here today, but I'm sure that they'll get a copy of the DVD when it's finished. They always said that they were organized in 1911, and it still says it on the fire department letterhead. And they claim that that's when the fire department was started. But that wasn't true. I found documentation that goes back to at least 1884. So I talked to several authorities in St. Paul to find out what organized really means. And it seems in the late 1890s or 1900, the state of Minnesota and the legislature appropriated some money in the form of grant money because they realized there was a lot of small fire departments in the state that were very poorly equipped. But in order to get any of this grant money, you had to accomplish four things. Now, number one, you had to elect a set of officers. You had to hold monthly meetings. You had to keep the minutes of these meetings. And you had to establish bylaws for your fire department and relief association. I know a lot of them did it maybe a lot earlier. Of course, Cold Spring was a proactive department way back in the 1880s. They already had officers in 1884. But anyway, they met all these requirements, and in 1911, they were recognized by the state of Minnesota as being officially organized. I don't know how much money they've got, because when I started to do the history, I went to the city and asked them for some information if they had any minutes. And I was told very fastly that we had 2 fires, you know, and there are no records. So it was kind of a disappointment. I thought, well, what am I going to do now? So I thought about the old saying, you have to improvise, adapt, and overcome the situation. And that's what I did. So we knew we had an old waterless hose cart here that still is in existence at the Firehall, and it was made in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I contacted the waterless people, and they gave me a lot of information, and I've got pictures of the original sales brochures that they had back then. And then they also told me that over the years, the waterless company is located in Lower St. Paul, and they periodically had problems with flooding down there. Well, most of the time they would get all their records out in time, but sometimes they didn't. So a lot of the information that I was looking for had been lost. But they said there was 2 gentlemen that were in the Twin City area by the name of Mr. Ken Peterson and Ron Pearson, who made this their life hobby of tracking antique fire equipment, who got it and when they got it, and possibly even what they paid for it. So I contacted these gentlemen, and they gave me a lot of insight on this, and they were really the people responsible for telling me what the word organized meant. Now, we know that the city of Cold Spring was founded in what, 1856? And the records that I have as far back as we can go is 1884. And I would think in that time period, we must have had at least a bucket brigade of some sort, or probably Cold Spring wouldn't be here today. It would have been burned down a long time ago. Probably like you'd see in the days of the Old West, where everybody grabs a pail and dips it into the horse trough and proceeds to put out the fire down the street. But like I say, we have no records to prove that. But I contacted John Decker from the Stearns History Museum, and he had the tedious job years ago of taking all the county newspapers from the 1800s and putting them all on microfilm. Now, when he did that and he'd see an article that was newsworthy from Cold Spring, he clipped it out of there. And thank God he did. It saved me hours and hours of research. So the articles that I'm going to give you a timeline today are out of the old newspapers, mainly the St. Cloud Journal and the St. Cloud Times. And then later on, the Cold Spring Record, I believe, was started in 1899. So with that, I'm going to start with this timeline and read you some of the articles. And when I'm finished with that, then we're going to go on to the pieces of fire apparatus that was bought by Cold Spring back in the 1800s, 2 pieces of which are still in existence. I did find out that we had a hook and ladder rig, a 40-foot rig. And I said, Cold Spring? And those guys said, yes. And it's still around. It's at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. So I'll be showing you pictures of that as we go. But the first article that I found was from the St. Cloud Times, Wednesday, March 5th, 1884. Now Rita's got it up there, and you probably can't read it. So I'm going to read it for it. It says, at the last regular meeting of the Cold Spring Hook and Ladder Company, the following officers were elected. H.P. Hecklin, foreman; Matt Weiler, secretary; Arnie Fiden, first assistant; Peter Grine, second assistant; John Cray, treasurer; Joe Medford, Peter Hoffman, and Jacob Bold, finance committee. So you can see these guys are way ahead of their time as far as having officers before the state decided that that's what should happen. So the next article that I ran in was 1885. It's from the St. Cloud Journal on Thursday, December 15th. Mr. Peter Carl's house at Cold Springs, with the S, was burned last Saturday evening. Loss total. The village fire department is said to have done a first-class work at the fire. You have to understand, back in those days, fighting these fires was mainly containing the fire. As far as salvaging a building was almost impossible. They're all wooden structures, and by the time you got there, they're pretty much gone. Now, I talked about this hook and ladder company. I guess in 1894, the St. Cloud Times said our hook and ladder company was out for a little while last Saturday afternoon to try the apparatus and to see that everything was all ship-shape yet. A set of runners has been put on the pump, and shortly the hook and ladder truck will also be fitted out with a set. Our village, by the way, has one of the best apparatus in the state for a village of its size. Now, these pieces of equipment that I'm going to be showing you had 2 drawbars on them. They were basically pulled by hand. Or you could commandeer somebody's horse along the street and hook that up. There was 2 drawbars with the simple pin that you drop into it, and you could switch from the drawbar that had handles that the men could pull, or you could hook this up so a horse could pull them. And they had that for the hook and ladder and for the pumper. Now, I asked when this was acquired, and it's about in the late 1880s. They acquired the hose cart, which we now have, a hook and ladder rig, and an early pumper. Now, it's quite an expense, I think, for the village at that time, but they seen the importance of having a decent fire department. Then we got the St. Cloud Times, Wednesday, May 5th, 1897. In order to give our fire department a little exercise, the village council at its last meeting decided to give a little practice and accordingly had a fire built on last Saturday night, which was said to have a few gallons of kerosene near the brewery. After dark, the fire was lit. The fire bell rung and the brewery whistle blown, and those not in the scheme of things sought the brewery on fire. Our boys, however, did it bravely and had the fire soon extinguished. And we go to 1896 from the St. Cloud Times, Wednesday, June 24th. It said there's some preparations are being made for the forthcoming celebration of the glorious 4th of July. There's going to be a show of confidence. Everybody in that Cold Spring is not to be outdone by any village of its size or even larger place within the state. The program of the day is rich and varied. In the forenoon there will be a grand parade formed by the following: the herald of the day on a richly dressed and flagged stallion, Cold Springs Brass Band, Hook and Ladder Company, and various other things down the line it would go. And the parade will form at Maurin's Hall, the largest hall within the county, at 9 a.m. March through the principal streets of the village and back to the hall where the village president, I. Kramer, will deliver an address of welcome. Now, throughout the years, the fire department was also responsible for kind of lining up these 4th of July parades. And down the line, they made it kind of a fundraiser as well to buy some more equipment. Now, on St. Cloud Times, Wednesday, May 11th, 1898, it says, Friday morning, the barn belonging to John Schutz was set on fire by his little children playing with matches. Our Hook and Ladder Company turned out to witness the spectacle. As usual, the pump didn't work. And the barn burned to the ground. No insurance. Total loss, $50. Of course, $50 was a lot of money back in those days. And now we're going to move up to about 1899. And this is out of the record at that time. You look at in the record, it's still there today. They had on the inside page in the lower right-hand corner is what they have today. It's called the community events. And it lists all the things that are going on for the month. Well, they had this back in the 1899 in the record as well. Only back then they would list the fraternal organizations such as the Catholic Order of Foresters and St. Joseph Society, St. Anna's Society for married women, St. Rose Society for young ladies, the Cold Spring Cadet Band, and at the bottom they would say the Cold Spring Hook and Ladder Company meets the last Tuesday of each month in the City Hall. M. Gross, Secretary. Cold Spring Record, Wednesday, January 31st, 1900. We have this week completed printing of the Constitution and the bylaws of the Cold Spring Fire Department and ask you to examine our work. And if you want anything in this line, call and see us. At that same year, Cold Spring Fire Department, 1900, Wednesday, March 28th, the Cold Spring Fire Department held its annual meeting at the Village Hall last night. Members were very near all present, and all the regular business had been disposed of. New officers for the ensuing year were elected. Results of the election were as follows. Chief at Large, M. Gross. Assistant Chief, J.B. Glass. Secretary, J.B. Glass. Treasurer, N.C. Wenner. And the Finance Committee was John Sauer, Andrew Heisler, and John B. Glass. Now, I remember in the fire hall we had a lot of old things upstairs, a lot of old pictures, and there were some old newspaper articles that I know Mike Hoffman and I seen. And in that, some of these newspaper articles, which sadly were thrown out by some of the members, and we lost a lot of our history there because it didn't seem important to them. This was only a few years ago, and I'm really disappointed to see that, but it's done. But in one of these old publications, the fire department back then met once a year. And I remember reading an article that the fire department met at the Merchants Hotel, which is Weber's store, as most of us remember it as, or lately the dollar store before it closed. And they held their annual meeting. They elected officers, collected their dues, and then they bought a cigar for every one of their members and an achtel of beer and the rest of the evening was spent playing cards. Now, for you people that aren't from the land of the lederhosen, an achtel of beer was an eighth of a barrel. So I'm thinking whatever they took in for dues that day, they spent that night and they were good for the rest of the year. Life should be that simple today. We got this 4th of July, which parades that I was telling you about were in later articles too. But anyway, that article I wish I would have got a copy of, but it's gone, but I remember it well. Rita, can we move on to the hose cart? Okay, this is the first piece of equipment that the fire department bought. There was 3 actually, and the fire department still has this today. It is a model number 1 and is equipped with the following equipment. It has 50 feet of drag rope, which is in this area right here, and a rope wheel, 2 pipe holders, and now it came equipped with 2 30-inch play pipes, which are your nozzles, 2 metal toolboxes, which are in the back over here, and wrenches. Now this piece of equipment was stored up in the pump houses here where the old water tower used to be up by the brewery years ago. And somewhere along the line some chemical got spilled on it, and it always ended up with a white film. Well, when they built the new fire hall, it got brought down there, and now we have it above the dispatcher's office. But we could never get that white film off the rig. And it was painted kind of a maroon color with black pinstriping. So we tried everything under the sun, and it came very close to being repainted. And I thought at all costs we should try and keep the original paint on it. So then out of the clear blue I tried some Armor All Supreme Shine. I sprayed it on one area and wiped it in and let it dry. No more white film. So we went over the whole thing twice with this, and it not only brought the maroon color back, but it also brought back the pinstriping to the way it was, almost the way it was like brand new. So I was happy that we didn't have to over-restore this thing. Now this hose reel was capable of carrying 1,000 feet of 2.5-inch fire hose. Let's go to the next picture. This is what it looks like today. And I can't imagine dragging this thing down the street, because in the later years, Dave Hennon and I took this down. There's the Waterous. Let's back up one. There's the toolbox. It says it's from the Waterous Company. That wrench is still in there to tighten the hubs and the bearings on the axles. I was amazed that that's still there, but it is. Now what we did, this is what it looks like today. Took this picture. Well, this is Dave Hennon and I pulling it through the parish festival. Now that rig weighs over 500 pounds without all the 2.5-inch fire hose. So I can't imagine what that was all about to drag this down the streets, especially gravel streets with ruts and things. And here you see that rope and a little bit of a hand winch. And people ask, well, what the heck was that for? Well, sometimes you had to get up a hill. So you take this rope and you tie it to a tree or something, and with the help of some men, you could winch this rig up to where you needed it. That's what that hose, the line on the front end was for. Now you'll see the 2 play pipes there. They got kind of yellow covering on there. Well, they were wrapped with a cord in order to insulate your hands when you're fighting a fire, because they're solid brass play pipes. When they went and rewrapped these with cord, so at least you could hang on to them. So people are wondering already why it was wrapped in cord. That's the whole reason behind that. Let's go on to there's the hook and ladder. So when I contacted these two gentlemen from the Twin Cities. They told me about Cold Springs Hook and Ladder, and I was amazed. And when they told me it was still in existence, that really got me interested. So I contacted my buddy John again, and I said, do you know anybody down at the Minnesota Historical Society that I could call? And he said, yeah, Mr. Matt Anderson is one of the chief curators at the Minnesota Historical Society. So I gave him a call, and I told him what we were up to, and he said, by all means, you can come on down, but give me about a week. A lot of this equipment is in the annex storage. It's not always on display in a museum. They have permanent displays like any museum, and then they have rotating displays from time to time, so that when you come there, it's not always the same thing. Same is true at the Stearns History Museum. It rotates, so keep people's interest. And they told me that this rig was bought around 1880s or 1890, and it came from the private collection of Mr. Fred A. Waterous Sr., who donated about 12 pieces to the Minnesota Historical Society in about 1966. And Cold Springs Rig was one of those. And I would imagine we got rid of that somewhere in the 50s. Anyway, it was a size number 1. The production plate on it, brass plate, is still production number 29. It had one 40-foot extension ladder with a screw-powered elevating device, cable and drum for hoisting the top section, improved dog for catching and releasing the top ladder. Also include one 20-foot single ladder, one 18-foot single ladder, one 16-foot, one 16-foot roof ladder with hooks, 4 pike poles, 6 rubber buckets, 2 fire axes with pick heads, 4 fire department lanterns with patented water shields, one 12-inch automatic gong, a pull-down rope with steel hooks and chain, and a drag rope and reel. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. When we found out about this, my friend and I, Harold Fuzzy Fiello and I, went down there to see this. And this is what Cold Springs Rig looks like today. It had been repainted, but all of the equipment that I talked about is still on there except the 4 lanterns and the 6 rubber buckets, which is understandable. They would deteriorate in time. Otherwise, it's all there, and I was just amazed. And it still says, let's advance another picture. Well, there's the front end. Let's see the front end. What I was talking about, there's different poles. You can see the one it's hooked up to. The guys can pull this down the street by hand. Otherwise, they'll lift the pin, put the other one in, and now you're ready to commandeer somebody's horse to draw this thing. But what amazed me is there's no seat on this thing that you could direct horses. So someone would have to get on the lead horse to lead them to where you want to go. Okay. There's a few more pictures showing the back end of it and the front end of it. And as you see, they've got it on a metal frame so that the wheels and everything are off the ground. It's no longer supported by its wheels. And there's Fuzzy standing next to it. It still says Cold Springs Hook and Ladder Company number 1. I think somebody had repainted that, because knowing the Waterous Company and how they operated, that would have been professionally done, and probably even had some pinstriping of some sort, but someone down the line decided to repaint this. Now, after the hook and ladder, they also had an early pumper. And we did some research on that. We don't have any pictures of Cold Springs. But Mr. Peterson, who I've been talking about earlier, had been quite a collector of antique fire equipment. And when Waterous had its 125th anniversary, he brought his rig down, and that was what you see here. Cold Spring had one very much like this. It was a one-cylinder gas-operated engine with a pump. And in research, you'll find in history, the early gas engines weren't that reliable, As you can see that I had in the article, they came to the barn fire and the engine wouldn't start and they watched the barn burn down. Well, this went on for a number of years. And then I think down the road, what really brought it to a head was in 1909 when the Ferdinand Peters house burned. And I have some articles about that. It said a $35,000 mansion goes up in smoke. Now, I've got the Journal, I've got the Richmond Standard, I've got the Cold Spring Record, and media hasn't changed one bit. There's so much variation. And I think they took some of the information and the rest they fabricate. It's much the way today too, I think only much worse. They probably get a fraction of the information and the rest is fabricated, so you really don't know what's what. But the St. Cloud Daily Times, July 30th, 1909, said that the fine new residence of which Ferdinand Peters of the Cold Spring Brewing Company had erected this summer was totally destroyed by fire at the noon hour today. The building was put up at a cost of $17,000 and was the finest residence in this section of the town. The insurance carried on the structure was about $10,000. The origin of the fire is unknown, though it is believed that it was caused by spontaneous combustion. The building had just been completed, but some of the inside painting, and it is believed that the rags soaked in linseed oil, which had been left by the painters, caused the blaze. Every effort was made to save the building, but to no avail. A hose was run from the brewery engine to the house, but the power of the engine was not enough to throw the water to the roof, and so the building slowly burned to the ground. Some of its furniture had already been moved into the building, but this was saved. Well, our fire department was trying to fight a fire with a pumper like this, and I don't think it could shoot a stream 3 stories high. And then another account is the St. Cloud Journal on July 30th, 1909. By a fire started about 1 o'clock this afternoon, magnificent mansion of Ferdinand Peters, the wealthy brewer of Cold Spring, was building into that village was burned to the ground. The loss is estimated between $30,000 and $35,000. The insurance was about $10,000. The origin of the disaster blaze is unknown. The carpenters had completed their work on the house, and the painters were busy finishing in the interior. As near as could be ascertained, the fire started from a pile of oily rags which the workmen had been using and had discarded. A match thrown by one of the men after lighting a pipe may have lit the oil, and before it was discovered, the flames had spread beyond control. The residence was situated across the street from the brewery, and it was only by the hardest efforts of the volunteer fire department that the brewery was saved. Mr. Peters is president of the Cold Spring Brewing Company. The house which was constructing was the most elegant and elaborate in the village. No furnishings had yet been moved into it, although it had been planned to do so in a short while. And the Richmond Standard on August 6th of 2009 said the new residence of Ferdinand Peters of Cold Spring, costing $17,000, burned to the ground last Friday afternoon. The fire started from a rubbish pile which was burning near the house and discovered was beyond control of the department. The house had just been completed, and the Peters family intended to move in a few days. The insurance carried on the house was about $10,000. After the fire had started, Richmond fire engine was telephoned, but by the time they arrived, the house was completely burned down. So you can see there's conflicting remarks here. One costing $17,000, and the next guy said it's $35,000. So it varied quite a bit. So let's go on to the next picture. Then in about 1910, they bought a bigger rig. And this was also a waterless gasoline fire engine, number 6, Class B. It was a 4-cylinder, 35 horsepower motor, and was fitted for hand and horse draft like the rest of the equipment was. It was simple, powerful, reliable, and economical. The durability and the efficiency, unquestionable. This is a perfect fire engine for small towns. The advantages are obvious. The pump capacity is 300 to 350 gallons a minute, throws one of 4 good effective fire streams, uses 3.5-inch suction hose and 2.5-inch discharge hose. Mounted on forged steel frame with oil-tempered steel springs and forged steel axles. Electric ignition by means of a magneto, starts instantly. Thoroughly dependable and absolutely guaranteed. Full particulars furnished on application, and we invite the correspondence from the officials of various towns and villages contemplating the purchase of a suitable fire equipment. The weight on this one was 2,700 pounds, and I think after that the Peters fire, this was a deciding point for getting a bigger pumper. And I know that we had one like this because years ago Joe Keebelbeck, who some of you folks know, had a farm out there where Granite West is today, and he was an avid photographer. And I had seen a film that he had taken after one of the 4th of July parades, I think in the early 50s. And he probably had taken pictures of the parade and had a little film left, and he was across the street where Nicky Knaus's barber shop was, if anybody remembers where that was. And he was shooting towards the middle bar, which is now Grumpy's, and he shot down the line real fast to Wenner's. But it went kind of fast, and there's only a few frames in it. But this engine was sitting across the street, and I'm willing to bet that that was Cold Springs Rig. It probably had been in the parade. Can we go to the next picture? Now this rig is also owned by one of the gentlemen from the Twin City area. When I explained what we had, and he says, yep, I have a model of that as well. Now this had a hood over the engine compartment to protect it. That's a midship pump. You can see the siphon here, and it is a rotary gear pump. So I knew we had one like that, and over the years, I'm quite a steam enthusiast. I go to the largest steam show in Minnesota, which is up in Rolog, Minnesota. And they have several huge sheds, you can go to the next one, of equipment that has yet to be restored that had been donated over the years. And I'd spotted this and I said, there it is. That's exactly what we had. And this particular model is waiting to be restored. They acquired from some small fire department up in northern Minnesota, I believe. But it did not have the hood over the engine compartment, so I quickly took a lot of pictures of it climbing on various pieces of thrash machines and whatnot all to get different pictures to give some people an insight of what this thing looked like with the hood off. Let's go to the next one. There you can see the gasoline engine. This is from the rear platform. You see the platform is right here where guys could ride on the back too. But it shows the gasoline engine, and it had a hand crank right here. Your magneto is there. Okay, let's go to the next one. There you can see the 4-cylinder engine and the pump being over in the middle here. Of course, this one you could drive on. And this tank over here held a small amount of water, and that was used to prime your pump to get going. Okay. Just a few more pictures of it from the top down. It sorely needs a good going over. The wheels are going to have to be rebuilt, but it's pretty much all intact otherwise, other than the cover for the engine, but I'm assuming maybe they have it, maybe they don't. So I decided to take these pictures just to give the general public a little better idea of what this pumper looked like. Okay, let's go to the next one. And on the side was their badge plate, manufactured by the Wadsworth Engine Company, St. Paul, Min. Now that happened to be a 1914 model, but Waterous didn't change their models too often. If it worked, why try and fix it? Okay, let's go down the road here. Next picture, please. Now, we had about 3 fire halls that I can remember, that I know of. Maybe there was one even before this one, but the earliest one was built somewhere around the 1880s and was located right down Main Street. And today would be about the entrance into the parking lot of the country store. Here's a picture of Main Street looking east. We've got George Tyson's bar and restaurant, and this was an apartment building. And then there was a park. And Bob, we can't see your house, but your house was behind that, or on the east of that. And this building here with the tower, that was their bell tower, was the fire hall. Of course, this building here is the Cold Spring Record. That's before Winners moved on to the corner. Okay, let's try the next one. Here's another picture, and this is looking west on 4th Street from Sauk Street. This was the First National Bank. This was a drugstore at the time and later became Peter's Meat Market. And there you can just see the fire hall there. There was an alley between these two buildings. And that building was, had one stall, and in the front had a small office, I imagine, for the city council. And behind that was a jail. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, let's go to the next picture. Well, maybe we'll talk about it now. Now, this small town jail was usually used probably over the weekends. Somebody'd get a little bit drunk or disorderly and they could spend the night in jail and dry out, and the next morning they let you go and say, don't do that again. Well, somewhere after 1886, and this is the only story I have to tell about this jail because most of the time you never find out anything about those, was that there was some horses stolen from the Bavarian settlement. Some of you locals know where the Bavarian settlement was, which is northwest of town here. If you take the Glenwood Road off of Big Fish Lake and you head west and you end up coming in on the northeast end of Richmond, that whole area was called Bavarian settlement. Anyway, they had the misfortunes of having some horses stolen. And the guys that stole them weren't too smart. They ended up trying to sell them around Eden Valley area. And of course there was billboards up describing these horses in detail. And they were soon caught. Well, they were brought back to Cold Spring and they were thrown in our jail, which was in the back of this old fire hall. And they put the constable had put his deputy in charge of him overnight, and he went home. Well, sometime over the evening or the wee hours of the morning, 6 men came with hoods over their heads, and no, it was not the Ku Klux Klan. And they tied up the deputy and took custody of these 4 horse thieves. Well, in the morning when the constable got there, they unleashed him and said, well, they didn't know, is this a conspiracy? Are there a total of 10 guys now, or is there still the 4? So they formed a posse and they started combing the town, trying to find any evidence or clues of where these guys might have been. Well, it didn't take too long. They got to the east end of town and they found the 4 horse thieves hanging over the side of the railroad bridge. So they saved our poor constable a full day's work taking him down to St. Cloud and back, which was a full day, that was back in those days, to be arraigned. I guess they believed in instant justice. But I know it was between 1886 and 1900, Most of the people don't want to talk about that. I think some still know about it, who they were. Were they locals or were they some of the people from out in that area? We don't know. But Matt Hummerding told me that story many years ago as he sat on the bench over there in front of Weber's store. And I thought, that's one I want to remember. Okay. Here's an aerial view that was taken by, I don't know. But anyway, there is Peters. You could just see that building right there is the fire hall. You can see it's not a very big building. And someone asked me, well, how many members did the department have? Well, we have complete records at the fire department from 1911 on. And in 1911, it showed 11 members on the department. And it had 17 men, 17 in 1911. And I would assume that by that time they had at least 20 men. But I can't imagine them all trying to get into that little office building up front, which was probably the village hall, or maybe the council met there. And that probably explains why they went across the street to the Merchants Hotel to have their meetings. Okay, can we take one more? We really don't have a decent picture of the fire hall, let's say point blank in the front, but you can pick them up from some of the older photographs that we have. Now, they used this fire hall until about 1955. And that's when they ordered the 55, which we call the 56 Ford fire truck. And I think at that time, they got rid of some of the old equipment, like the 40-foot hook and ladder. And they had an old Pierce Arrow fire truck at that time ready, and then the 46 Chev pumper. So when they got the 56 Ford, it was a tight squeeze to get into this old fire hall. And they decided that they needed to look for something a little bit bigger. So they moved up to the street to Jones's gas station. And he had intentions of selling the gas station and moving and building a new one out towards the highway. I think he sold cars too. At one time there was 4 car dealerships in Cold Spring, and he was one of them. So the city, or the village at that time yet, we didn't become a city until maybe the last 15, 20 years. And they bought this building because it had 2 stalls. And then they moved the fire department into that building. Okay. In 1958, there's a picture, this is taken from the Cold Spring Record, I believe. The old fire hall burned. At the time, I believe it was empty. Maybe that's when some of our records went up in smoke. We don't know. I do know that there's 3 kinds of fire. There's a convenience fire, which is pretty much self-explanatory. Then you have a friction fire. That's where the mortgage rubs up against the insurance policy and you get spontaneous combustion. And then there's a third type, and we talked about that when I was on the fire department, was that the sparrows were smoking again. And you say, what? Yeah, sparrows. It is a proven fact that sparrows will pick up cigarette butts and put them in their nests. We found that true on barn fires. You get out to a barn fire, you get it all out, and you ask the farmer, well, did you put up some green hay lately? Nope. Haven't had hay in that loft for 2-3 years. Well, then either it was electrical or those sparrows were smoking again. And you need 3 things for a fire. You need fuel, oxygen, and heat. You take one of the 3 away and your fire's out. So there's something to think about. If somebody's careless with these cigarette butts, you can be bet that a sparrow will probably pick it up and put it in his nest. Now, whether that happened here, that we lost all our records or not, I'm not pointing any direction, or in any direction there, but it's possible that the sparrows were probably smoking and then our old fire hall went up in smoke. Like I say, I don't know if it was still in use in '58 or not. The trucks were out of there already. Maybe the city had been using it for storage, I don't know. But that was burned and then they tore that down. Okay. So we moved over here, which today is the Wealth Care Building. This shows that when it was still the fire hall, we had 2 stalls, which were a lot deeper. And over here, we had a library slash city hall slash police department. In the back over here was one little stall, and that was our maintenance department. We had 2 guys in the maintenance department who would sweep the streets by hand, and they ended up with having a Dodge dump truck and a grader that was pulled behind, and you ran that by hand. That was the maintenance department in Cold Spring for many years. But anyway, we were in this fire hall until about the 1980s. I'm not real sure the exact date of when the new fire hall was built, but then they moved into the new complex that they're in today. Now, in my research, I discovered 2 things. They have the old saying, some things never change. Well, it was true at the fire department. Back in the 1880s, they used waterless equipment. Today, we're still using waterless equipment. Our 2 mainline pumpers have waterless midship pumps. And I can tell you as a fact, as a pump operator, very reliable pumps, relatively easy to maintain and to run. I hope that that continues in the future. And not only that, we're still using waterless hydrants today. I think about 99 and 9/10 of our hydrants today are still waterless hydrants from St. Paul. The other thing that I noticed was what we had talked about earlier. In the articles of the St. Cloud, or the Cold Spring Record, in the community calendar, back in 1900, the fire department met the last Tuesday of the month. That is still true today. They're still meeting on the same day of the month. The times may have varied a little bit, but there you are. Some of these things just don't change over the course of the years. Now, I would hope that the fire department gets everything straightened out, because they celebrated their 100th anniversary in 2011, and that's not correct as of today. Hopefully they get that straightened out, and maybe we could probably celebrate our 150th anniversary on time. So, are there any questions? Paul?
I remember when I was a kid, and I think it was the Wells Carry location, whenever there was a fire, they would write on a blackboard.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of theories about why that was. Do you know why they wrote it on the blackboard?
Well, back then, their fire system, they didn't have pagers, but they were hooked up to a phone system. And of course, everybody had a phone at home. It would ring continuously until you picked it up. Well, then one picked it up, another one picked it up, and I think there was another fire phone down at Keese's, if I'm not, am I correct? And
I think the Legion had one.
Right.
Yep.
Keese's had it, Otto's Incorporated did all the fire calls.
Okay.
They came from Otto's until they got too old, and then Keese's took over, and guess who got the weekends and nights? Fired the neighbor next to the police department. That was us and Pat Cheeley. And then
See?
had to be home on a weekend or stay home at night from the other one.
See, Clara, see, all about location, location, location.
No fun.
But anyway, what they did is they would have that, and write it on the chalkboard in case some guys didn't get there in time or their wives picked up the phone. Then maybe a truck or two was gone, and if they would send some more out, they had an idea where they were going.
That's what we thought it was, but we also thought it might possibly be all the curious people, because you knew everybody.
Well, some of that was true.
From following,
Yep.
they knew where it was.
That's been a problem over the years, and I think it still is a problem to some extent. And they just get in your way. But yeah, it was one way of doing it, put it on the board. Then they also had a system of rings. And when before you went out the hall, you took a ring and you put it on this hook over here. That way they could tell how many guys are on the scene already. Between that and what was on the chalkboard, then you could figure out what was going on. And then before the 911 addresses that they have now with the nice blue signs that gives you the number, we had what they called a fire number that the fire department would sell. It would look like a red license plate. And it would had fire department number so and so. So what we did is we had 2 Rolodexes on the rescue truck. One was by your name, and it gave the directions, and the other one was by the fire number, so it was a cross-reference. You pull that up and give you the directions exactly how to get to your place. And that's what they used until the 911 system came into effect. Paul, you had a question.
Have any fire department members been seriously injured?
No, but we did have one by the name of Tom Kramer that would tell all the new members that he, years ago, when he got on, he said he fell off a 35-foot extension ladder. And everybody, geez, did you get hurt? He says, no, I missed the first rung.
I have a question. Obviously, the borders of the city were not as wide as it is now. So the township, what happened if there was a fire just right outside of town? Did the city?
We did that. Yes, we did that with that rural fire was out toward St. Nicholas that we talked about where the barn burned down. I do believe that they did cover a certain territory. We still do today, that the three neighboring townships, to a certain extent, we cover some of them. And that probably was a deciding factor too in how much grant money they got from the state. Not only the size of your town, but the area that you protected. But that's still in effect today. We still protect the townships around us as well as the city.
But obviously, when they were doing by horse or pulling those pumpers, they couldn't go quite as far, as fast.
Well, they would have commandeered horses to go out of town. I'm sure you're not going to pull them that far by hand. But, and back then the law was, we didn't have horses per se in the fire hall at all times. You had the right to commandeer anybody's horse on the street to be used for a fire. That was the rule of thumb back then. So are there any other questions? Yes?
When the city actually put in like the fire hydrants?
Well, this is something I had a question of too, but remember, we had 2 fires. We have no records. We don't know. I would have really liked to know when the first hydrants and things came to town, but they can't tell me that. And I know when it was put in, it was strictly downtown business district to start with. And when they branched out into the residential areas, I can't answer that question. I wish I could.
So if there would have been a fire, where would the water have come from?
I think with the hard suction, they would run that down somebody's well until they got hydrants. Any other questions?
Do you have any statistics on fatal fires and coal?
No, I don't. That I don't have. Like I say, John meticulously went through these old newspapers when he was microfilming them, and some of the articles, usually if they were covering, they would cover a fire if it was from Cold Spring. It didn't make much news otherwise in the St. Cloud papers. But we don't know of any, at this point in time, if there was any fatalities at any given time. It's possible, but I don't have anything on it right now. I'm relying on old newspaper articles.
There was one.
There was one?
The owner of the hotel burned down.
The Merchants Hotel?
No, not the Merchants.
Oh, I mean the Central House.
Central House.
Yes.
That woman insisted on going back in the house, into the place, something. I thought she died.
That's a possibility. Like I say, we don't have all the copies of the Cold Spring record since 1899 either. I remember as a young man I was in the Boy Scouts and we'd have paper drives. And about the time the Honer family was selling the record office to the Ostring family, he had all the copies of the records lined up along the walls in the print shop. And before he turned it over to the Ostrings, he called the scoutmaster up and says, "You guys can have all these for your paper drive." So there went Cold Spring's history right now. Would have been nice to have a complete set of the Cold Spring record, but we have some here in the society, but just a fraction of what it should be. Yes?
I know you do a lot of rescue calls and stuff too, but how many actual fires average in a year?
Well, to last year, I know the fire department responded to 411 calls. When I got on, it was like 100, 125, and we said, this can't get any worse. Well, it has, but 90 to 95% of those are rescues. They don't have too many fires anymore, not like we used to. That much I can say. It's tamed that down quite a bit, but the rescues have just gone out of sight, so. Al?
How many current members?
There are 30 members on the department. They might be looking for a couple right now, but that's what they had been maintaining as long as I was on, was 30 members. And I think when I went through all the minutes from 1911 on, must have been somewhere around World War II, I think, is when they bumped it up to a few more. I think they were stuck at around 20, 25. And it was interesting to go through those records. I have the lists, which we can maybe talk about down the road, of every chief, assistant chief, secretary on the fire department since 1911, and I have the names of all the members since 1911. Our first fire chief, after they were officially organized, was Charles Bernick. The Bernick name you're probably familiar with, Roy Bernick in Pepsi Distributing. It was his grandfather, and he was a wagon maker here in town and had his building somewhere in the area where the side bar is. Later on he moved to St. Joe and then to St. Cloud, and they started the bottling company. But he was our first fire chief, so.
Charlie, you have a question?
Oh, Charlie.
Why do the sirens so go off?
The sirens still go off when there's a call, but they don't sound them anytime after 8 o'clock in the evening. And of course they all have pagers now, but the siren, I think basically during the day is to let people know that there's something going on, because you've got a lot of activity in town during the day. But yeah, that's the reason for that. And I can remember as a kid, they'd blow it at what, 8, 9 o'clock in the evening? Boy, now it's time. All the kids better go in the house.
And that's what Bob was saying.
I wish that was true today. Paul?
Where's the new fire department at? Where are they at yet?
Don't ask me. I've been retired since 2007. I'm not familiar with what's going on. Us retired guys don't get down there that often.
Speaking of retirement, what kind of benefits do you get?
Well, the retirement is set up.
What are you living on? Should I ask personal questions? No, I shouldn't.
What happens is the Relief Association was set up, and 2% of everybody's fire insurance goes into a fund. And that has to be invested in state-approved funds. And then what they do, depending upon how everything is going with your investments and so forth, they will allow you so much for every year of service. And when you retire, you get paid a lump sum and then you're out the door. So
Yeah, I'll take it.
you have to take it all at once. They don't want to deal with the paperwork and the administrative work on it. So
someone who's been on the fire department for 10 years would get some sort of retirement benefits?
at the time when I got on, I think you had to have, how many years was it to be fully vested?
10.
10?
Yeah.
You had to have 10 years. Now it's down to 5. Yeah. You had to be vested by 10 years. And then that was all calibrated by so much every year. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank you this morning for coming in. I hope you enjoyed listening to the early history as much as I enjoyed telling it to you. And maybe down the road we can continue from 1909 on. I've a lot more to tell, but our department has a rich history, and I did a total of 21 articles on the department, including all our equipment we've had from that point on. And there's a real interesting story to tell about the first motorized truck we had, which was a 1917 Pierce Arrow. But we'll get to that down the road maybe, if they want to invite me back. Other than that, have a good day.